Occupied France, August 1943. Above the patchwork fields, a dark, distant smear on the horizon resolved into the unmistakable, boxy silhouette of American B-24 Liberators. Their presence, a daily affront to the Reich's western defenses, signaled another deep penetration raid, threatening industrial centers and morale alike. Each formation represented a calculated gamble, a commitment of resources and lives intended to fracture the German war machine, and each successful return fueled the Allied narrative of relentless pressure. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, these formations were not merely targets, they were the embodiment of an existential threat, flying fortresses designed to absorb punishment and deliver destruction. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, a veteran of the Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageder, knew the B-24's reputation intimately. His Focke-Wulf Fw 190A5, a short-nosed, radial-engined fighter, represented the pinnacle of German interceptor design, a machine crafted for speed and devastating firepower. Yet even its capabilities were tested by the sheer resilience of the American bomber. The B-24 Liberator, a product of Consolidated Aircraft, was a study in utilitarian design, often perceived as less elegant than its Boeing counterpart, the B-17. Its distinctive high aspect ratio Davis wing, however, provided superior lift and speed, allowing it to carry a heavier bomb load further and faster than many contemporary bombers. This wing, combined with 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp engines, each generating 1,200 horsepower, propelled the Liberator to altitudes exceeding 25,000 feet, often pushing the limits of unpressurized flight for its crews. From a technical standpoint, the Liberator's defensive armament was formidable, typically comprising 10.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, distributed in nose, dorsal, belly, and tail turrets, along with waist positions. This provided interlocking fields of fire, creating a defensive porcupine effect that made head-on or tail-on attacks perilous. The sheer volume of lead these formations could unleash was a significant deterrent, often forcing attacking fighters to break off engagements prematurely. Production figures underscored the Liberator's strategic importance. By mid-1943, Consolidated and its licensees were rolling out B-24s at an unprecedented rate, ultimately producing over 18,000 units, making it the most mass-produced American military aircraft in history. This industrial output dwarfed German fighter production, creating an attrition problem for the Luftwaffe that no amount of pilot skill could indefinitely overcome. Each downed Liberator was a temporary reprieve, but the stream continued unabated. The strategic implication of these bombing raids was profound, aimed at dismantling Germany's industrial capacity and crippling its ability to wage war. Factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs across occupied Europe felt the weight of these attacks. For the Luftwaffe, the imperative was clear: stop the bombers or face the slow strangulation of the homeland. This translated into a grim calculus for Richter and his comrades, where every engagement was a desperate attempt to stem an overwhelming tide. The sky above the Reich, once a domain of German air superiority, was becoming a contested space, filled with the drone of distant engines and the promise of impending violence. The formations of B-24s, observed with increasing frequency over the Reich, presented a new problem for the Luftwaffe. Their staggered boxes, designed to maximize interlocking fields of fire, initially seemed impenetrable. Yet German pilots, veterans of earlier campaigns, quickly began to dissect their vulnerabilities. The B-24, with its distinctive twin tail and broad high aspect ratio wing, was a larger, somewhat slower target than the B-17, and its defensive armament, while significant, was not without its blind spots. Analysis of early engagements, documented in Luftwaffe after-action reports from late 1943, revealed that the B-24's ventral turret offered a limited field of fire directly beneath the aircraft, and its nose armament, typically 2.50 caliber machine guns, struggled to deter head-on attacks. The waist gunners, positioned in open windows, were exposed to the slipstream and often found their traverse limited by the fuselage structure, particularly against fast-moving targets. This inherent structural limitation, a consequence of the B-24's design philosophy, prioritizing bomb load and range, became a tactical opening. The standard Luftwaffe interceptor, the Messerschmitt Bf 109G, with its top speed approaching 600 kilometers per hour, could achieve a significant speed differential against the B-24's cruising speed of around 350 kilometers per hour. The Focke-Wulf Fw 190A, even more robustly armed with two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns, offered a devastating punch. These aircraft, operating in staffline of 12 to 16 planes, could concentrate fire with an intensity that individual B-24s found difficult to counter. Even with their array of 10.50 caliber machine guns, German fighter pilots, under the direction of Jagdgeschwader commanders, began to refine their attack profiles. The preferred method involved a high-angle pass from above and behind, aimed at the B-24's relatively unprotected wing roots or fuselage, where fuel tanks and critical control lines were housed. Another tactic, born from observed deficiencies, involved coordinated head-on attacks. This approach, while dangerous due to the B-24's forward-firing guns, offered a brief, high-closure rate window where the bomber's defensive fire was less effective, especially if the attacking fighters flew in a wide, dispersed pattern that made tracking difficult for the nose gunners. The Luftwaffe also experimented with specialized anti-bomber weapons. The Werfer Granate 21 rocket, a 21-centimeter unguided projectile launched from tubes mounted under the wings of Bf 109s and Fw 190s, was introduced in late 1943. These rockets, while inaccurate against single targets, were designed to be fired into the dense bomber formations, creating large bursts that could shatter aircraft or disrupt their tight defensive boxes. A single hit from a WFR Gran 21 was often enough to cause catastrophic structural failure or ignite fuel tanks, effectively removing a B-24 from the formation. The psychological impact of these concentrated attacks was also a factor. The sight of multiple fighters diving through the formation, often trailing smoke or fire from their own hits, caused understandable distress among bomber crews. The sustained pressure forced B-24 pilots to maintain strict formation discipline, even as their aircraft were being torn apart, a testament to the training they had received. The Luftwaffe strategy was clear: inflict maximum damage, break the formation, and force individual bombers to become isolated, easier targets. This relentless pressure, applied with increasing sophistication, began to take a heavy toll. Northern France, October 1943. The formations of B-24 Liberators, heavy with their bomb loads and defensive armament, pressed eastward, a slow, metallic river against the pale morning sky. Their mission, a deep strike against industrial targets, carried the inherent risk of sustained aerial combat, a risk exacerbated by the increasing sophistication of German defensive tactics. This day, however, would see a particularly brutal evolution of those tactics, designed to exploit the very architecture of the American bomber and the psychological limits of its crews. From altitudes often exceeding 30,000 feet, where the air thinned and the cold bit with a ferocity that defied heated flight suits, the German fighters began their descent. These were not the cautious, probing attacks of earlier months, but rather committed high-speed dives, often initiated from behind and above the bomber stream. The Focke-Wulf Fw 190, with its robust radial engine and formidable armament, proved particularly adept at this maneuver, its pilots pushing the airframe to its structural limits to achieve maximum velocity. The dive itself was a calculated gamble, trading maneuverability for speed and surprise. Approaching at speeds that could exceed 400 miles per hour, sometimes reaching 500 in the terminal phase. The German fighters presented a fleeting target to the bomber gunners. The closing rate was so extreme that the reaction time for the B-24's defensive turrets, even the hydraulically assisted models, was drastically reduced. A gunner might acquire the target for only a few precious seconds before the fighter flashed through the formation. The primary aim of these dives was to penetrate the bomber's relatively vulnerable rear and upper fuselage. While the B-24 boasted 10 .50 caliber machine guns, their fields of fire were not uniformly distributed. The tail turret, with its twin 50s, offered a direct rear defense, but the speed of the diving attack often overwhelmed its traverse and elevation limits. The upper turret provided excellent coverage directly above, but the steep angle of the dive could bring the attacking fighter into an arc where the turret's guns could not depress sufficiently. The German pilots, often flying in pairs or small rot, would initiate their dives in a staggered fashion, one fighter aiming for the upper rear quarter, another for the lower, creating a complex threat vector. This disoriented the gunners, forcing them to split their attention between multiple, rapidly approaching targets. The concentrated fire from the Fw-190's two 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns delivered at such close range proved devastating. A single burst could cripple an engine, ignite fuel tanks, or sever control cables, often with catastrophic results. Damage reports from downed B-24s frequently cited extensive structural damage to the tail section, the fuselage around the bomb bay, and the inner engine nacelles, consistent with high-angle, high-velocity impacts. Interrogation files from captured German pilots confirmed the deliberate strategy. We aimed for the wings, or the cockpit if we could. The psychological toll on the bomber crews was immense. The sudden, violent appearance of an enemy fighter, seemingly materializing from the sun or the clouds, left little time for preparation or coordinated defense. The sheer volume of fire delivered by a diving Fw-190, particularly the later A6 and A7 variants, which carried four 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns, could saturate a target zone. A single such fighter could unleash approximately 20 kilograms of ordnance per second during a brief engagement, a destructive capacity far exceeding the defensive capabilities of an individual bomber. This method of attack was a direct response to the increasing density of American bomber formations, seeking to break their cohesion through shock and concentrated firepower rather than prolonged dogfights. This tactic, while effective, was not without its own inherent risks for the German pilots. The high speeds achieved in the dive placed enormous stress on the airframe, requiring meticulous maintenance and skilled piloting to avoid structural failure. Pulling out of such a dive, especially under evasive fire, could induce G-forces that approached or exceeded the limits of human endurance, sometimes resulting in temporary blackouts or loss of control. Yet, the imperative to inflict maximum damage on the bomber stream outweighed these individual risks, a stark calculus of attrition. Over Germany, late 1943. The impact of the head-on attacks, coupled with sustained pursuit, began to manifest in the grim arithmetic of bomber losses. 8th Air Force damage reports from autumn missions frequently documented B-24s returning with catastrophic nose damage, shattered cockpits, and often critically wounded or dead flight crews in the forward compartments. The sheer kinetic energy of a 20mm or 30mm cannon shell, impacting at a combined closing speed approaching 700 miles per hour, tore through the relatively lightly armored nose sections with devastating efficiency. Analysis of recovered wreckage, particularly from missions targeting Schweinfurt and Regensburg, revealed distinct patterns of damage consistent with these frontal assaults. The B-24, with its distinctive twin tail and box-like fuselage, presented a large frontal aspect. making it a comparatively easy target for a skilled interceptor pilot executing a high-speed pass. Its defensive armament, primarily .50 caliber machine guns, was formidable from the beam and tail, but the forward firing capabilities were concentrated in the nose turret and a single flexible mount, often insufficient to deter a determined, high-speed head-on attack. Loss statistics from these periods underscored the vulnerability. For instance, the 14th October 1943 Schweinfurt mission, a deep penetration raid, saw 60 B-17s and B-24s destroyed out of 291 dispatched, a loss rate of over 20%. While B-17s comprised the majority of the force that day, the B-24s, operating in separate formations, faced similar, if not intensified, pressure. Subsequent missions continued to incur unsustainable attrition. The 8th Air Force's daily operational summaries frequently listed dozens of aircraft missing in action or destroyed, a stark numerical testament to the effectiveness of the German interceptor tactics. The strategic implication of these losses was profound. Each downed bomber represented a crew of 10 highly trained men, a significant investment in manufacturing resources, and a reduction in the bombing capacity critical to the air campaign. The psychological toll on surviving crews, witnessing their comrades vanish in fiery explosions or spiral earthward, was immense. This sustained attrition threatened the very viability of unescorted daylight precision bombing, forcing a re-evaluation of doctrine and tactics. The initial belief in the self-defending bomber formation had proven tragically optimistic in the face of coordinated, aggressive interceptor operations. The necessity for effective long-range escort became not merely a tactical preference, but an existential requirement for the bomber force. The German pilots, by exploiting the blind spots and vulnerabilities of the B-24 with such lethal precision, had effectively stalled the strategic bombing offensive deep into enemy territory. Their success created an operational imperative that would reshape the air war. Over Germany, late 1943. The arrival of the P-47 Thunderbolt and later the P-51 Mustang began to fundamentally reshape the air war. Initially, these American escort fighters possessed limited range, often turning back at the German border, leaving the bomber formations vulnerable to sustained Luftwaffe attacks deep within the Reich. This created a predictable sanctuary for German interceptors, allowing them to engage with relative impunity once the short-legged escorts departed. The P-47, a formidable air-to-air combatant, was initially hampered by its internal fuel capacity, restricting its operational radius. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine, a 2,000 horsepower behemoth, provided exceptional performance at altitude, but its thirst for 100-octane aviation fuel meant that without auxiliary tanks, its escort missions were brief. Early combat reports from the 8th Air Force indicated that while the Thunderbolt could dominate any German fighter it encountered, its inability to stay with the bombers for the entirety of their missions remained a critical strategic weakness. The solution emerged in the form of detachable external fuel tanks, first 75-gallon, then 108-gallon, and eventually 150-gallon paper or metal drop tanks. These engineering adaptations, though seemingly minor, exponentially expanded the P-47's combat radius. A single 108-gallon tank could add over an hour of flight time, translating into hundreds of additional miles of escort coverage, pushing the fighter screen deeper into enemy territory and challenging the Luftwaffe's home defense strategy. However, the true game-changer arrived with the North American P-51 Mustang. Its laminar flow wing design, a revolutionary aerodynamic innovation, drastically reduced drag, allowing for greater speed and efficiency. Coupled with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, specifically the Packard-built V1650-3 and later the V1657, which offered superior high-altitude performance and fuel economy compared to the P-47's radial, the Mustang possessed an unparalleled combination of speed, altitude, and crucially, range. The Mustang's internal fuel capacity of 269 gallons, combined with two 75-gallon drop tanks, extended its combat radius to over 600 miles. This meant P-51s could fly from bases in England, escort bombers to targets as far as Berlin or beyond, engage in combat, and return. Damage reports from late 1943 and early 1944 show a marked decrease in bomber losses on missions where P-51s provided full route escort, directly correlating with the fighters' increased presence over target areas. The strategic implications were profound. The Luftwaffe could no longer reliably disengage from escorts at the German border, regroup, and then fall upon unescorted bomber streams. Now, the American fighters stayed with the bombers, often arriving over the target before the German interceptors could even form up. This forced the Luftwaffe to engage the highly capable P-51s on their terms, often at altitudes and speeds where the Mustang held a distinct advantage. Interrogation files from captured German pilots revealed a growing frustration and demoralization. The element of surprise and the ability to conduct multiple passes on vulnerable bombers were eroding. The constant presence of American fighters meant every engagement became a fight for survival rather than a calculated interception of slow-moving targets. The skies over Germany were no longer a sanctuary. Early 1944. The American 8th Air Force, having endured months of attrition, began to adapt its escort tactics with increasing urgency. Commanders, analyzing combat reports and gun camera footage, recognized the predictable pattern of the German interceptors' high-speed diving attacks, particularly against the B-24 formations that often flew at slightly lower altitudes than the B-17s. This predictability, born of the Luftwaffe's need for speed to mitigate the bomber's defensive fire, offered a new vulnerability to exploit. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-51 Mustang pilots, now operating with external fuel tanks that significantly extended their range, began to alter their patrol patterns. Instead of merely flying alongside or slightly behind the bomber stream, a portion of the escort force would climb to altitudes several thousand feet above the bombers, often positioning themselves ahead of the main formation. This strategic elevation allowed them to gain a crucial energy advantage, mirroring the very tactic the Germans had perfected. This elevated positioning was not without its risks. It demanded precise navigation and constant vigilance to avoid losing contact with the bomber stream, especially in the often turbulent upper atmosphere. The P-47, with its robust airframe and radial engine, proved particularly adept at these high-altitude maneuvers, its heavy construction allowing for rapid dives and pullouts without structural compromise. Its 8 50-caliber machine guns, firing at a combined rate of approximately 4,800 rounds per minute, provided a formidable burst of destructive power. The tactical shift meant that as German fighters, primarily the FW-190s and Bf-109s, initiated their characteristic high-speed dives from above the bomber formations, they would increasingly encounter American escorts already positioned to intercept them. The element of surprise, once a German advantage, began to erode. These engagements often became head-on passes or high-speed chases, dramatically increasing the risk for the attacking Luftwaffe pilots. Damage reports from captured German pilots and post-mission debriefings indicated a growing frustration within Luftwaffe units regarding these new escort dispositions. They reported P-47s appearing from nowhere above their attack vectors, forcing premature breaks or leading to devastating engagements at the very moment they intended to commit to their bomber passes. The average number of successful German passes per bomber formation began a measurable decline. As documented in 8 Air Force intelligence summaries, the strategic implication was profound. The American escorts were no longer merely reactive defenders, but proactive hunters, dictating terms of engagement to the German interceptors. This forced the Luftwaffe to expend more fuel and time seeking unescorted avenues of attack, or to engage in costly dogfights with superior numbers of American fighters. The psychological toll on German pilots, facing an ever-present threat from above, became increasingly evident in their radio chatter and subsequent interrogation files. The skies over Germany were changing. Northern Germany, March 1944. The sustained presence of American escort fighters began to fundamentally alter the calculus of German interception. Where once the unhindered dive from altitude offered a fleeting but often devastating opportunity against the heavy bombers, the arrival of Mustangs and Thunderbolts introduced a new, lethal variable into that equation. This shift was not instantaneous, but rather a gradual erosion of a once effective tactic. Damage reports from 8th Air Force missions in late 1943 frequently documented dive attacks, often from the sun, where single-engine fighters would plummet through the bomber formations, delivering cannon and machine gun fire before attempting to escape. These attacks, while costly for the German pilots in terms of fuel, and often presenting a challenging pull-out maneuver, exploited the B-24's relative vulnerability to topside attacks and the limitations of its defensive armament arcs. The sheer speed of these passes made sustained defensive fire difficult. The P-51B and P-47D, with their extended range and increasing numbers, began to patrol the bomber streams with an aggressive mandate. Their operational doctrine emphasized not just defensive screening, but active engagement, often pushing ahead of the bomber boxes to intercept incoming German formations. This proactive stance meant that the German fighter groups, often already depleted by attrition, encountered the escorts at higher altitudes and further out from their intended targets. Interrogation files from captured Luftwaffe pilots began to reflect a growing frustration and a tangible shift in tactics. Pilots described having to break off attack runs prematurely or even before initiating them due to the appearance of American fighters. The preferred high-speed dive, which relied on surprise and a clear path, became increasingly hazardous, as a pursuing Mustang or Thunderbolt could easily match or exceed the diving speed, turning the hunter into the hunted. The statistical evidence from mission summaries supported this qualitative shift. While initial engagement rates between German fighters and bombers remained high in early 1944, the proportion of successful, damaging attacks against the bombers began to decline. Instead, a larger percentage of German losses were attributed to engagements with escort fighters, often occurring before the German aircraft could even reach the bomber formations. Luftwaffe High Command directives, circulated among Jagdgeschwader units, increasingly emphasized avoiding direct engagement with the long-range fighters unless absolutely necessary, or when numerical superiority was assured. This directive implicitly acknowledged the deterrent effect of the escorts. The primary objective of destroying bombers was being overshadowed by the imperative of fighter survival. The strategic implication was profound. The German air defense was forced to expend its dwindling resources not on the bombers themselves, but on their protectors. The presence of the escorts, therefore, did not merely add another layer of defense. It fundamentally altered the battlefield dynamics. The audacious, high-stakes dive, once a staple of German interception, transformed from a calculated risk into a near-suicidal endeavor. The skies over Germany, once a hunting ground, became a contested domain where the hunter was now frequently hunted. The skies over Germany, once a hunting ground for the Luftwaffe, began to subtly, then dramatically alter. American long-range escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, were now appearing in numbers and with a reach that fundamentally challenged German air superiority. This shift was not merely a matter of presence, but of tactical evolution, a direct response to the Luftwaffe's devastatingly effective head-on attacks against unescorted or poorly escorted bomber streams. The P-51, with its laminar flow wing and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, possessed a speed and altitude advantage over many German interceptors, particularly at higher altitudes where bomber formations operated. Its internal fuel capacity, combined with droppable external tanks, provided a combat radius exceeding 800 miles, allowing it to accompany bombers deep into the Reich. Damage reports from early 1944 consistently noted the increasing frequency of escort fighter engagement, a stark contrast to the previous year's bomber-centric combat. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to engaging bombers with relative impunity after their initial passes, now found themselves confronted by agile, well-armed adversaries. The Me-109 and Fw-190, while formidable in their own right, often struggled to match the P-51's performance characteristics, especially its climb rate and sustained high-altitude speed. Production logs from Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories indicated a sustained output of approximately 1,500 to 2,000 fighter aircraft per month throughout late 1943 and early 1944. Yet these numbers were increasingly insufficient to counter the growing numerical and technological superiority of the Allied escort force. The strategic implication was profound. The daylight bombing campaign, previously a costly, sometimes unsustainable endeavor, began to yield more consistent results. Bomber crews, who had faced wave after wave of German fighters without adequate protection, now reported the presence of little friends 100 miles or more into enemy territory. Interrogation files of captured Luftwaffe pilots frequently contained frustrated accounts of engagements cut short by the intervention of American fighters, preventing the sustained, concentrated attacks that had proven so effective. This new reality forced the Luftwaffe to adapt, often unsuccessfully. Tactics evolved from massed frontal assaults to more cautious, opportunistic engagements, frequently attempting to draw escorts away from the bomber stream before attacking. However, the American escort doctrine, emphasizing close protection and aggressive pursuit, increasingly negated these efforts. The sheer attrition rate, evidenced by Luftwaffe loss reports showing a marked increase in fighter-on-fighter combat casualties, began to cripple the German fighter arm. The psychological impact on both sides was palpable. American bomber crews gained a renewed sense of security, while German pilots, once confident in their ability to penetrate bomber formations, now faced a significantly higher risk of interception and destruction. The meticulous records of the 8th Air Force show a dramatic decrease in the ratio of bombers lost per mission, even as mission depths increased. For instance, the loss rate for B-17s and B-24s, which had approached 10% on some deep penetration raids in 1943, steadily declined to under 5% by mid-1944, despite heavier defensive flak. The shift was not immediate or absolute, but it marked a definitive turning point in the air war. The Luftwaffe's ability to dictate the terms of engagement over Germany's industrial heartland was eroding. The fighter force, once the pride of the Reich, found itself increasingly on the defensive. Its pilots and machines stretched thin against an ever-growing tide of Allied air power. The average operational readiness rate for Luftwaffe fighter units, as documented in unit strength reports, dipped below 60% by the summer of 1944.